The moment they stepped through the doors of the restaurant, an overwhelming sense of sophistication hit them. The restaurant was everything the teen had imagined, and more, an embodiment of elegance reserved for those who belonged in a world of luxury. The lights above cast a soft glow over the room, illuminating polished wood floors that gleamed beneath their shoes. The air smelled faintly of fresh roses, mixed with a subtle hint of fine wine and gourmet dishes. The hum of quiet conversation blended with the clinking of glassware, adding to the refined atmosphere that made the teen feel both excited and anxious at the same time. The long white tablecloths draped across each table seemed to whisper of status, adorned with pristine silverware arranged with the kind of precision that could only come from years of practice. Crystal wine glasses sparkled in the dim light, each one placed with such meticulous care that it almost felt like a performance. The soft music playing in the background provided an almost surreal sense of calm, making the space feel even more distant and unfamiliar. As they walked through the door, the teen couldn't help but notice how out of place he felt. He tugged at the collar of his shirt, trying to adjust to the tightness of the dress code he wasn't used to. His mother had insisted they dress up for the occasion, but his nerves were beginning to overwhelm him. This wasn't his world. He wasn't used to places like this, where every person seemed to be born with a sense of entitlement, where money and status were worn like invisible armor. It was hard not to feel like an outsider. His mother, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. She walked with grace, her steps measured and confident, a stark contrast to the teen's more hesitant pace. She had spent years in these types of places, dealing with business meetings and high-profile events. This, to her, was just another dinner, another evening of quiet conversation and expensive food. "You'll get used to it," she whispered, her voice soothing, yet laced with an authority that made him feel a little less nervous. "Just enjoy the evening. We're here to have a good time." The teen nodded, trying to relax. His mother led him toward their table, where a tall, well-dressed hostess was waiting to greet them. The hostess's smile was wide, professional, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She studied them for a moment, pausing just slightly longer than necessary. It wasn't unusual for people to notice them, especially in places like this. The teen was used to the stares by now, though it still made him uncomfortable. His mother, however, paid no attention, already walking toward their table. As they were seated, the teen couldn't help but notice the strange looks from some of the other diners. They were subtle but unmistakable. Quick glances over the top of menus, whispered words that didn't quite stay quiet enough. He felt a sudden weight in his chest, like eyes were drilling into him from all sides. His mother, as if sensing his discomfort, placed a hand on his arm and gave him a reassuring smile. "Relax, baby. We belong here just as much as anyone else," she whispered, her voice calm but firm. Her words, though simple, had a way of easing his nerves. She'd always known how to make him feel grounded, even in situations where he felt completely out of place. But just as he was starting to breathe a little easier, a figure approached their table, tall, dressed in a dark suit that matched the luxurious atmosphere. It was the waiter, his gait slow and deliberate, eyes fixed on them in a way that made the teen feel like he was being examined, as if he were nothing more than an object to be scrutinized. The waiter's expression was cold, dismissive, and it didn't take long for the teen to notice the subtle sneer that tugged at the corners of his mouth. His eyes briefly flicked to the teen, then to his mother, as if calculating the worth of their presence in the restaurant. "Good evening," the waiter said, his voice clipped and polite, but with an edge that made the teen uncomfortable. "I'll be your server tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink?" The teen opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the waiter's gaze shifted to the mother. "And you, madam? Wine selection for the evening?" he asked, his tone slightly softer, more respectful. But it was clear the difference in his approach had nothing to do with politeness. It was all about status. The teen looked at his mother, a little confused by the way the waiter treated him, like he didn't even exist, like he wasn't important enough to even be spoken to properly. His mother didn't seem fazed by the waiter's attitude. She smiled slightly and nodded, engaging in a calm conversation about the wine selection. But the teen felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His nerves flared again. He wasn't used to being treated like this, ignored, condescended to. His mind raced. He wasn't sure if he should say something or let it go. But something in the way the waiter was looking at him made him uneasy, like he wasn't supposed to be here, like he wasn't welcome. The waiter's eyes flicked back to him, almost too quickly to catch, but the teen noticed. There it was again, the dismissive glance, the barely there sneer. It was as if he was being judged for every move he made. As the waiter turned to walk away, the teen shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. He glanced at his mother, but she was still talking to the waiter, her calm demeanor showing no sign of being affected by the exchange. She was used to this, and somehow that made him feel both comforted and a little sad. But this was just the beginning. The waiter returned to their table with a slight air of superiority, his steps measured and his eyes fixed on the menu, seemingly already judging their choices before they had even ordered. There was something about the way he moved, his stiff posture, and the quickness of his glances that made the teen uncomfortable. It was as if this place, this restaurant, wasn't meant for people like him. The air around them suddenly felt a little colder. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" The waiter's voice, although polite, carried an underlying tone that felt dismissive, as if his words were meant for someone who should already know the correct way to behave in such a place. He focused more on the teen than on the mother, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if measuring him. The teen hesitated, unsure of what to order. This was his first time at a place like this, and he wasn't sure if he should try something fancy or stick with something more familiar. The last thing he wanted was to seem out of place. "I'll have a lemonade," the teen said, his voice soft, but trying to sound confident. The waiter paused, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't speak right away, and it was almost as if he was weighing the teen's request. Finally he nodded, but there was something condescending in his response. "A lemonade?" the waiter asked, his tone dropping just enough to make it seem like a question that was meant to imply something about the teen's knowledge. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer a fine wine to start? Something more fitting for your age and surroundings, perhaps?" The words hung in the air for a moment. The teen blinked, feeling the sting of the implication, but not entirely sure how to respond. Was the waiter suggesting he didn't belong here because of his drink choice, or was it because of something else? The teen's mind raced, but he kept his voice steady. "No, lemonade is fine," the teen replied, looking down at the menu in front of him, hoping the waiter would just move on and let the awkwardness pass. The waiter gave a slight nod, his eyes lingering on the teen for just a moment, too long before shifting his gaze back to the mother, who was still looking over the wine list. The teen noticed how the waiter's attitude immediately shifted when addressing her, his tone warmer, more respectful. The teen felt a growing knot in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being treated differently, and not in a way that made him feel welcome. He could feel the waiter's eyes on him, almost like he was scrutinizing him in a way that made him uncomfortable, judging him for something the teen couldn't quite put his finger on. His mother, still flipping through the wine list, didn't seem to notice the tension building between the waiter and her son. She was too focused on choosing the perfect wine for the evening. But the teen noticed everything, from the way the waiter's gaze lingered on him, to the sharpness of his voice, to the way he barely made eye contact when he spoke to him. It was all building up to something that the teen couldn't shake, something that made him feel small. "Madam, would you like to pair that wine with any of our specials?" the waiter asked, his voice taking on a tone of deference. The difference in how he spoke to the teen versus the mother was almost jarring. "Just the wine for now, thank you," the mother replied, her voice calm and steady, without any sign of irritation. She didn't seem to notice the subtle tension, or if she did, she chose not to acknowledge it. The teen, however, could feel it. His fingers tightened around the edge of the menu as he tried to focus, to find something to order, but his mind kept wandering back to the exchange with the waiter. He had tried to brush it off, but something in the way the waiter had looked at him kept nagging at him. The teen fidgeted nervously, tapping his fingers lightly on the table, avoiding eye contact with the waiter, who seemed to be growing more impatient with each passing moment. As the waiter turned away, the teen felt a growing discomfort in his chest. He couldn't quite figure it out. Was he imagining it? Or was there something about the waiter's attitude that was off? He tried to push the thought aside, but it kept coming back. Why was he being treated like this? What had he done wrong? "Mom, do you think he was, I don't know, judging me?" the teen finally asked, his voice quiet, unsure. The mother's sharp eyes flicked over to him, and for the briefest moment he saw the flash of something in her gaze, a look of awareness, but she said nothing. Her lips pressed together as she studied the waiter from across the room, who was now speaking with another table. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she gave a slight shake of her head and leaned in closer, her voice soft enough that only the teen could hear. "Don't let it get to you. People like him think they're better than others, but we know better." The teen looked at his mother, searching her face for any sign of frustration or anger, but she remained calm, her expression unreadable. "Just enjoy the evening, sweetheart," she continued, her voice calm but firm. "Don't let his attitude ruin our night." But as she spoke, the teen couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The waiter's subtle comments, the way he dismissed him and treated him like he didn't belong, all left a lingering, uncomfortable feeling in the pit of his stomach. Just as he was about to say something more, the waiter returned, this time with their drinks. He placed the lemonade in front of the teen with a deliberate slowness, his fingers brushing the rim of the glass with an almost calculated gesture, as though to emphasize how little he thought of the drink choice. The teen's grip on the glass tightened. He couldn't help it. His irritation was bubbling up now, but he fought to keep it under control. He wasn't going to let this man's words or actions ruin the night. Not with his mother here, not when she was trying so hard to make this a good experience for both of them. The waiter didn't look at him again, instead shifting his attention back to the mother. "Are you sure you wouldn't like the lamb special to go with that wine, madam?" he asked, with a pleasant, almost sickeningly sweet smile. The mother smiled politely, but said no. The waiter nodded curtly and left again, and this time the teen couldn't help but let out a small sigh of frustration. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to create any more tension than there already was, but it was hard to ignore how the waiter was treating him. "Just keep calm," he muttered to himself, but it didn't help. The uneasy feeling stayed with him, gnawing at his insides. The evening had barely progressed, but already the teen felt a growing unease at the table. The waiter, once distant but polite, had begun to show his true colors. It started with small, subtle actions, small smirks, raised eyebrows, and a tone of voice that didn't quite match the situation. But now, as the evening wore on, the waiter's behavior became more overt. His attitude, his subtle but unmistakable condescension, was impossible to ignore. The teen had ordered a simple appetizer, nothing extravagant, just a salad to start. But when the waiter returned with the order, there was a distinct lack of care in the way he placed the plate on the table. The teen watched as the waiter almost slammed it down, making sure to avoid any eye contact, as though to emphasize his indifference. "Well, here you go," the waiter said, with a tone that made it clear he couldn't be bothered. "I hope this is up to your standards." His voice, though still polite on the surface, carried an edge that stung. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he spoke, as though the teen didn't deserve the same level of service as the other guests in the restaurant. The teen hesitated, trying to keep his composure. He knew it was probably best to let it go. He didn't want to make things worse. But as the waiter turned to leave, he couldn't help but notice the way the waiter rolled his eyes. "Anything else for you, kid?" the waiter said, this time speaking in a louder, almost mocking tone, as though the teen couldn't understand simple phrases. He spoke slowly with exaggerated enunciation, as if talking to a child. "Water? More lemonade, maybe?" The teen's heart sank. He wasn't sure if he should say something or remain silent. But the way the waiter had spoken to him, the condescension in his voice, the deliberate slow pace, it left him feeling small. He fought the urge to speak up, trying to maintain his composure, but the words were starting to bubble up inside of him. "No, I'm good for now," the teen said, forcing himself to smile. He didn't want to escalate things, but it was getting harder to ignore the way the waiter was treating him. It was clear now that the waiter saw him as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in a place like this. But the waiter wasn't done. He lingered near their table, standing just out of reach, but close enough to make his presence felt. "I can get you some water," he offered, but his tone was far from polite. "You look thirsty. Maybe you need some help with that?" The teen looked up, feeling a flush of anger rising in his chest. He had already asked for water earlier, and now the waiter was offering it with a tone that made it sound like it was a huge favor. He could see the exaggerated movements, the waiter holding the glass of water in the air, slowly pouring it with exaggerated care, as though he was doing the teen a massive service. "Yeah, just a little more water, please," the teen muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. He was finding it harder and harder to control his emotions. Why was this waiter treating him like this? What had he done wrong? The waiter finally responded, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, of course. Can't let the kid go thirsty, right? I'll be right back." As the waiter walked away, the teen looked over at his mother, his face flushed with frustration. He wanted to say something, but he wasn't sure if it was the right moment. The waiter's behavior was unmistakable now. There was no denying it. He was being treated differently, and it wasn't because of anything he had done. It was because of who he was, and that hurt more than anything else. "Mom," the teen started, his voice shaky. "What's going on? Why is he treating me like that?" The mother's eyes, sharp and observant, had already caught the change in the waiter's behavior. She looked at her son, her expression unreadable, but the teen could see the tension in her shoulders. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her calm as she processed what was happening. "He's treating you that way because he thinks he can. People like him think they're better than others," she said quietly, her voice low enough that only the teen could hear. "We'll deal with it in a minute, but for now, just try to focus on enjoying the meal." The teen nodded, but inside, the anger was building. He wanted to stand up and shout at the waiter, to demand an explanation for his behavior, but he held back. His mother had told him to stay calm. She had told him to focus on the night, and he didn't want to make things worse. But with every passing moment, it became harder to ignore the sting of the waiter's words. The waiter returned with the water, placing the glass on the table with an almost exaggerated flourish. He didn't meet the teen's gaze this time, but his smirk was undeniable. The teen could feel the tension in the air, the waiter's barely concealed disdain hanging like a cloud over their table. The teen had reached his limit. He wasn't going to let this man continue treating him like this. "Excuse me," the teen said, his voice firm but controlled. He had been quiet up until now, but enough was enough. "Why are you treating me this way?" The waiter paused, the smirk faltering for just a moment. He looked at the teen as though the question was something absurd, as though the idea of someone asking him such a thing was preposterous. The teen's heart was pounding now, the words rushing out before he could stop them. "You're treating me like I don't belong here. Why? What did I do?" The waiter's eyes flicked to the teen, then quickly darted away. He let out a small laugh, a dismissive chuckle that made the teen's skin crawl. "Kid, you're overreacting," the waiter said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "It's just a restaurant. Don't take things so personally." He turned to walk away, muttering under his breath as he left, "Maybe next time you'll know what to order." The teen's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment it felt like the world was closing in around him. He wanted to do something, to stand up and call the waiter out on his behavior, but he felt the weight of his mother's calm presence beside him. She hadn't said anything yet, but the tension in her body told him she was preparing for something. "Mom," the teen whispered, his voice shaky with a mix of anger and confusion. "He's treating me like I don't matter." His mother's expression hardened as she stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. There was a quiet strength in her gaze now, something fierce and protective. She looked at her son, her face stern, and for the first time that evening the teen saw the power in her composure. "Stay here," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'll handle it." With that she walked toward the waiter, her steps purposeful and unwavering, her back straight. The tension in the air was palpable as she approached him, the entire restaurant seeming to hold its breath. "He's treating me like I don't matter." His mother's expression hardened as she stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. There was a quiet strength in her gaze now, something fierce and protective. She looked at her son, her face stern, and for the first time that evening the teen saw the power in her composure. "Stay here," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'll handle it." With that she walked toward the waiter, her steps purposeful and unwavering, her back straight. The tension in the air was palpable as she approached him, the entire restaurant seeming to hold its breath. The moment the mother stood up, the entire atmosphere around their table shifted. The teen, still reeling from the waiter's earlier behavior, watched his mother with a mixture of surprise and admiration. She had been calm and composed up until now, but something in her stance, the way she moved, told him that this wasn't just any ordinary confrontation. This was going to be something different. The waiter, who had already turned his back to them, froze for a brief moment when he heard the mother's calm but firm voice behind him. "I need to speak with you," she said, her tone not loud but commanding. "Right now." The waiter turned slowly, a condescending smile still plastered on his face, but it faltered the moment he locked eyes with her. He had no idea what he was about to face. Sorry," he muttered, as if trying to brush off her request, but the slight tremor in his voice revealed his growing discomfort. He had been in the service industry long enough to know that when someone asked to speak to him like that, it usually wasn't a good sign. The mother didn't waste any time. She stood tall, her gaze steady as she addressed him directly. "Your behavior has been unacceptable from the moment we sat down. You've treated my son as if he doesn't belong here, and I will not stand for it any longer." The waiter blinked, clearly caught off guard. He opened his mouth possibly to offer some form of apology, but the mother held up a hand, silencing him before he could speak. "No," she continued, her voice unwavering, "I don't want your apology. It's not sincere. I've watched you roll your eyes, speak condescendingly to my son, and treat him with disrespect. You think that because we don't look like everyone else in here, we don't belong. But let me make one thing clear. That is not your decision to make." The waiter's face turned a shade of red, and for a split second he was at a loss for words. He had probably expected a simple complaint or a meek confrontation, not this. A knot began to form in his stomach as he realized he had underestimated the situation entirely. He started, trying to recover, but his words stumbled over each other. I just... The mother didn't let him finish. She wasn't interested in his excuses. "You're not even sorry for how you've treated us. You're sorry because you've been caught," she said coldly. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" The waiter stood there, flustered and sweating, his nervousness now evident. His body language shifted, and he began to shuffle on his feet, unsure of how to handle the situation. But before he could try to weasel his way out of it, the mother's next words stopped him dead in his tracks. "My name is Mother's name," she said, her voice lowering just enough for the waiter to understand the weight behind her words. "I'm the founder of Company Name, a law firm with deep connections in this city. I have influence here, in the business world, in the legal field, and with the community." The waiter's face drained of color as his eyes widened in realization. He hadn't expected this. What started as a casual dinner was now turning into something far more significant than he could have ever anticipated. His apology caught in his throat as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. "I've built my reputation by working hard, by making sure that the people who serve me and my family do so with dignity and respect," the mother continued, her voice now taking on a chilling calmness. "But what you've done tonight crosses a line. I'm sure you understand the consequences of that." The teen, still seated but now sitting up straighter, watched his mother's every move. He had never seen her so composed, so calm, but with a clear underlying strength that made her words feel like a threat. It wasn't the kind of power you could see in someone's posture or hear in their voice. It was the kind of power that commanded respect. The waiter, now visibly sweating and pale, took a step back. His mouth moved, but no words came out at first. The entire restaurant had gone eerily quiet, all eyes now drawn to the confrontation. "I'm sorry," he stammered, his apology coming out much too late, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to offend you. Please, I'm really sorry. It's just sometimes I don't know what's wrong with me." The words felt empty, insincere. It was clear that he was only apologizing because of who the mother was, not because he truly understood the harm he had caused. But the mother wasn't buying it. "I've heard enough," she said firmly, cutting him off mid-apology. "You think you can treat people like this because you assume they're powerless. You've made a mistake, and now you'll deal with the consequences." By this point, the manager had started to notice the commotion and was slowly making his way toward their table, his eyes darting from the waiter to the mother, trying to understand what was going on. But before he could approach, the mother raised a hand, signaling for him to stay back. "I don't need the manager right now," she said, her gaze shifting from the waiter to the manager as she spoke. "This has already been handled." The manager, still standing several feet away, looked uncertain but didn't press further. He seemed to recognize that the situation was escalating and that the person standing before him was someone far more important than the average diner. The waiter, however, remained rooted to the spot, his face a mix of confusion and fear. He could feel his job slipping through his fingers, and the weight of his mistake settled heavily on his shoulders. He had no idea who this woman was when she first entered the restaurant. If he had, maybe he would have acted differently. But now he knew this wasn't someone he could just apologize to and hope it would be forgotten. "Please," the waiter said, his voice quiet now, nearly pleading. "I'm really sorry. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean any harm." The mother, however, was no longer listening to his words. She had seen enough. She had made her point clear, and now she was ready to let the consequences unfold. "Your behavior has already been noted," she said coldly. "Now you'll learn a very important lesson. Actions have consequences, and I'll be ensuring that yours are known." With that, the mother turned to her son, who was still in his seat, watching the exchange with wide eyes. She gave him a small nod, a silent reassurance that everything was going to be okay now. "Let's go," she said, her voice softening as she turned to her son, now ready to leave the restaurant. The teen stood up, his body still tense, but his confidence growing. They had made it through the confrontation, and the power of his mother's words had left an impact not just on the waiter, but on everyone in the restaurant. As they walked out, the waiter's apology followed them, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and the mother had made sure that everyone knew exactly who they were dealing with. After the tense confrontation had taken place, the mother and her son were standing tall, ready to leave the restaurant. The air was thick with discomfort, but the teen felt a sense of empowerment he had never experienced before. His mother had handled the situation with such poise and strength, and he couldn't help but feel proud of her. He could sense that their exit was not just a retreat, it was a victory. Just as they were about to leave, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the quiet hum of the dining area. The manager had arrived, and from his hurried pace, it was clear he had been briefed on the situation. He was a tall man, dressed in the same upscale attire as the other staff, but there was a noticeable difference in his demeanor. The manager's face was flushed, and he looked slightly panicked as he approached the table. His eyes flicked nervously from the mother to the waiter, who stood in the background, still shaken and sweating, his hands fidgeting in a way that suggested he didn't know where to put them. The mother remained calm, her expression unchanged as the manager reached them. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," the manager said immediately, bowing his head slightly in an attempt to show contrition. "I've just been informed of the situation, and I want to assure you that we take matters like this very seriously. This kind of behavior is absolutely unacceptable in our establishment." The mother didn't say anything at first. She simply gave him a steady, measured look, as though assessing whether his apology was genuine or just a formality. Her silence was powerful, making the manager fidget nervously under her gaze. Finally, after what felt like a long pause, she spoke. "I'm glad to hear you understand the gravity of the situation," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I would appreciate it if you took the necessary steps to ensure this never happens again." The manager nodded vigorously, eager to show that he was on her side. "Of course, ma'am. I've already informed the staff that we will be covering your meal for the evening, and we want to make sure you receive nothing but the highest level of service from here on out." The mother gave a slight nod, acknowledging the gesture, but her gaze remained on the waiter, who was standing in the corner, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He looked like a man who knew his fate had been sealed. "And what about him?" she asked, her voice still cool, but the weight of her words hung in the air. "What will happen to him?" The manager glanced over at the waiter, who had his head down, his shoulders slumped. "He will be spoken to, ma'am. I will ensure that he receives the necessary reprimand for his actions. Rest assured, this behavior will not be tolerated again." The waiter, who had been standing in the background, took a step forward, his face pale. He cleared his throat, his voice unsteady as he spoke, trying to salvage whatever remained of his dignity. "Ma'am, I'm really sorry for what happened. I didn't mean to treat you or your son like that. It was wrong of me," he stammered, his eyes nervously shifting between the mother and the manager. "Please, I didn't realize who you were." The mother's gaze remained icy, and she didn't respond immediately. She wasn't interested in his apology anymore. She knew the damage had already been done, and no amount of backpedaling would erase what had happened. The teen, who had been silently watching the exchange, suddenly felt a surge of confidence. He had witnessed his mother handle this situation with such grace and power, and he now understood the true meaning of standing up for oneself. He looked directly at the waiter, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't just disrespect my mom, you disrespected me, and I'm not going to forget that," he said, his words cutting through the air. The waiter's face turned even paler, and he took a step back, unable to form a response. The manager, sensing the escalating tension, quickly stepped in to diffuse the situation. "That's enough, please," he said, raising a hand. "I'm sure this is a misunderstanding, and I want to make sure we resolve this. If you'd like to stay, I'll personally ensure you're taken care of from here on out." But the mother had already made her decision. "We're leaving," she said simply, "but let me make one thing clear. This isn't just about a poor dining experience, it's about respect. And you, as the manager, need to ensure your staff understands that." The manager nodded earnestly. "Of course, ma'am. I promise you this will be addressed immediately. We will ensure this never happens again." The teen felt a sense of closure as he and his mother turned to leave, but the moment they reached the door, the manager's voice called out to them one last time. "Please, allow me to arrange for a car service to take you wherever you need to go," he offered, eager to make amends. "It's the least we can do after this." The mother smiled faintly, the slightest hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "No need," she said, her voice still calm but firm. "We'll manage, but thank you for your offer." As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit their faces, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the restaurant. The teen took a deep breath, feeling the tension leave his body. His mother had handled the situation with poise, and the message had been sent loud and clear. Inside the restaurant, the waiter stood there, humiliated and trembling. His apology had been half-hearted, his words failing to repair the damage he had caused. The manager, now focused on dealing with the aftermath, turned his attention back to the waiter. "Go back to your duties," the manager said curtly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll talk about this later." As the waiter shuffled away, his head still hung low, the manager sighed deeply. He knew this wouldn't be the last time they dealt with a customer like this. But he also knew that the consequences for this waiter would be far greater than any reprimand he could offer. The situation had unfolded quickly, but it had made one thing abundantly clear. Racism, no matter how subtle or disguised, would not be tolerated in their establishment. And it had taken the strength and resolve of a mother to show them that. As the evening unfolded, the teen could feel a transformation taking place inside him. The tension from the confrontation had finally dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of pride. He glanced over at his mother, who sat across from him, her calm demeanor still evident, despite the emotional storm they had just weathered. She had been the epitome of grace and strength in the face of adversity, and he couldn't help but admire her even more in that moment. He took a deep breath, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "Thanks, Mom," he said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "I'm proud of you. The way you handled everything, it was incredible." The mother's smile was gentle, but filled with a quiet strength. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "I'm proud of you, too," she replied, her voice steady. "You don't have to accept disrespect from anyone. You have the right to stand up for yourself, always." Her words resonated with the teen, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly empowered. In that moment, he realized that standing up for oneself wasn't about being confrontational. It was about knowing your worth and never allowing anyone to diminish it. It wasn't just his mother who had shown strength. He had too by supporting her and not backing down. The mother's gaze softened as she looked at her son. "You know," she said, "people might try to tear you down because of who you are, where you come from, or what you look like. But none of that matters. What matters is how you carry yourself, how you treat others, and the strength you have to stand firm when it counts." The teen nodded, a sense of clarity settling over him. It wasn't just about the incident at the restaurant. It was about life in general. The lessons his mother had taught him would stay with him forever, guiding him through the inevitable challenges that life would throw his way. The camera shifts, capturing the quiet resolution in the restaurant. The earlier tension between the mother and son and the waiter had been replaced by a calm confidence that now filled the air. The staff, eager to make up for the earlier missteps, brought over complimentary dishes, each one more elegant than the last. They placed them gently on the table, their actions more careful than before, as if trying to convey a sense of redemption. The mother and son exchanged a brief glance, acknowledging the change in atmosphere. The teen felt a sense of closure, the meal now tasting sweeter than it would have otherwise. It was a symbol of overcoming adversity, of taking control of a situation and making it their own. The camera zooms in on the teen as he takes a bite of the food, a satisfied smile forming on his face. His mother, too, is visibly enjoying the meal, though her focus remains on her son, her pride evident in the way she watches him. For a brief moment, the world around them fades away, and it feels as though time has stopped. They are no longer the target of prejudice, they are simply a mother and son, enjoying a well-deserved evening together. In the background, the waiter lingers, still visibly embarrassed. He avoids eye contact with the mother and son, knowing that his actions have left an indelible mark. The manager, now keeping a closer eye on the situation, moves around the restaurant, ensuring that the guests are comfortable and that the earlier chaos has been smoothed over. The teen's eyes briefly meet the waiter's, but he doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. The message had already been delivered. The waiter knows that he's been exposed for his actions, and no amount of apology could undo the damage. It's a silent acknowledgement, a moment of realization for both parties. The camera pulls back slowly, showing the mother and son sitting together, their laughter filling the air. The restaurant, once a place of discomfort, now feels like a backdrop to a powerful story of resilience and empowerment. Racism is a form of hate that can only thrive in silence. When we stand up for ourselves, we take away its power. If you believe in standing up against racism and want to hear more stories of resilience and courage, subscribe to our channel. Together, we can make a difference. The screen fades to the channel logo and the video ends.